Hello and welcome everybody to H602, and it seems that I am on a roll. I continue with the English variety. This will be the third one today actually, because I made one earlier, long one, very interesting, but it managed to make itself deleted. I almost had a fit. But be back to normal here, and I will continue to speak about how the subject-object order once developed and why it's very similar to skip the subjects as skipping, for instance, C in the equation E equals m square C. So taking the subject away guarantees that everything will be skewed, incorrect, not depicting any reality, not telling you anything about reality, and especially as we know how this thing, the subject-object order, once developed. It has a history, it has a name, it has a birth certificate, as you can say. It is noticed when it turned up. It did not exist before. So we have a certain, more or less certain time when it did exist. It did not exist 700 before Christ, but it most certainly existed a couple of hundred years before Christ. So somewhere in that time period it developed. So it's an invention, and it's a human invention. It's not coming from reality at all. And I think those things are very important to bear in mind. This is not something coming out of reality. It's not something that can't be questioned. It's not something that is, so to speak, engraved in stone. But what is true is nobody questioned it. Until quantum physics, nobody questioned the idea that it should be a separation between observer and observed, subject and object, and so forth. So in a way, this makes quantum mechanics, quantum physics, more important than anything else that ever turned up in human thought, because it's accurately and gravely questions that the only partitioning of the whole is between subject and object. And if that is not the case, which it obviously is not, what happens then? Well, that's a question to be answered by the ambigram group. And I think it's very important to sort of say underpin the gravity of this saying, and the gravity is just that. Subject-object partitioning is a human development. It's not the only way to partition or see the world. It could be in three parts. I have some suggestions here. You say reality with a big R, we can say that C plus Y minus S equals reality. Or we can also see that Y and G multiplied by H makes reality. And we can also say that a little bit of Heidegger, that aletheia minus theia makes reality, which is a very interesting way of putting the whole thing, and actually it's more flexible than the subject-object order. And of course every area has been influenced by this sort of fundamental unquestioned thinking, and that's another important thing. Not only has nobody questioned it, nobody had, so to speak, identified the subject-object order. It has always been beneath human thought. It has never been identified as a partitioning. It's something that Kant would have called a priori, and it remains a priori until Kant makes his philosophy, all the way until 1920s, when we see that this is actually a partitioning going on here. We assumed something. I think that could be actually the most correct. We discovered that there were an underlying assumption, something that nobody on this world, on this earth, pointed out, an underlying unknown assumption, and that we were having that assumption was revealed by quantum physics. Nobody knew about it before. But of course it was inbuilt in everything. Just the fact that we were having objects, it's a part of this division. And also that we were looking outwards all the time instead of looking outwards and inwards. That's also caused by this division. The partitioning can be found anywhere. You can have sort of an archaeology of the partitioning, but nobody's spoken about it explicitly before quantum physics. That's the first time. And this is one of the things that nobody knows anything about. Because when you read a layman's book at quantum physics, it comes in such a format to describe the whole process that led up to the quantum physics as a process involving only classical physical experiments. And we have to realize that all the experiments made in quantum physics are made on the model of classical physics. They assume that the observer doesn't have a role to play, but they discover it has a role to play. But an unbiased experiment is yet to have done in a quantum physics way. And it can be hard to sort of pinpoint what sort of endeavor that would be. It doesn't come easy to mind to think that out. But it's definitely something completely different. And thereby I understand that the discovery of the partitioning is the most important thing, most important part of quantum physics. And here, to say it doesn't take any mathematics, to understand it doesn't take any mathematics or technical ambition. Of course, for an engineer, it helps to have mathematics, because otherwise you're just standing in front of a bare fact. But what you do need is a little bit more, and I will continue with that in a bit. Well, as said, there can be many different ways of partitioning the whole, and subject-object is only one way of doing it. early partitioning has never been questioned, and it has different tendencies that made it sort of more firmly established in some way. It doesn't have to be established. All of a sudden it doesn't cause that much problem. We can be inside of it and don't suffer from it. But there is pointers to this partitioning in language that developed from the period just after the Iliad and the Trojan Wars and all that. And those partitioning tendencies became afterhand stronger and stronger in language, and we started to have completely separated objects, things, and these were later reified by Plato, Socrates, and of course these things had their very own life. They had a beginning, they had a middle, and they had an end. And those were called the objects. And behind the objects were the ideas. And the ideas were in some way cleaner than the proper objects. And of course this way of viewing things is completely Western. It doesn't happen really in other languages. You don't have objects like that. And if you have an experience, you don't see objects in the world. You have a direct gestalt, as they say, a holistic experience of everything at one time. There's no partitionings there. The partitioning is being made after the experience. They are after what happens, so to speak. It's always a little bit late. We can now, with modern electroencephalogram and MRI, actually see this process in work. How first there is some sort of experience, and then the partitioning starts. And these partitionings of the world, they become habituated after a while. They look a little bit like the metaphor from De Bono with his clay box filled with sand, and where water droplets makes first holes and then small rivulets that turn into rivers, and they join, and once they join they become larger and larger, and they tend to guide the next drops. And what we have in the end is a landscape formed by the drops, leading the drops, and it seems as these rivers, rivulets, streams always have been there. For every new thing, every drop that comes, it becomes firmer and firmer. It becomes an attitude. It solidifies. And this solidification process, it's what makes objects very firm. So you can say before they become too firm, they are just like flexible concepts. Definitions can be changed. We can move back and forward, where the concepts and the definitions are the explicit, and the implicit is the force behind. And this shifting, this constant shifting between the explicit and the implicit, it's what the world is. That's the world. That's the totality of everything. That totality of the explicit and the implicit, and yet more. For it constantly brings the whole thing further. There is a movement. And this is what Bohm called the hollow movement. It's a movement in the universe which is more fundamental than the objects, the explicit, implicit. It's reality. And one could say, very simplify that, the Greeks and onwards, they focus on a specific aspect of the explicit and completely ignores the implicit. While ignoring the implicit, they try to make the explicit filled with meaning, because it's lacking meaning. If it doesn't have the implicit, if it doesn't have the intention, if it doesn't have the embodiment, they become very weak. And already Parmenides noticed this. That became stronger with Plato. And instead of putting the body inside the equation, the subject, meaning, purpose, he went the other way and tried to make the meaning come from purification. And he felt that was a significant lack of meaning in the world. So he went the wrong way and made everything worse and worse and worse. And he complained about this. And nothing felt real in the world. And what he made himself is like extremely left-brained. And he was in the end not taking in the world at all. The same can be said in another way with his colleague, or what you could call it, the other also very important Greek philosopher, Aristotle. By the way, Aristotle is not a chum from East End named Aristotle. It's actually Greek, doesn't bring an H, and it's pronounced Aristotle without an H. And Aristotle founded empiricism, but he did it in a very Greek way. He didn't put the body inside, and he didn't put intention inside. Instead, he tried to find reality within reality somehow, that it was inside the objects. And in a way, these two tendencies, although they are opposing in a way, and they're always presented as opposing directions, and these were the two opposing directions that dominated Western thought. They are extremely similar. They are exactly the same thing. They both completely focus on the explicit, ignoring everything implicit. And it's a tendency to see the world stable, not changing, unmoving, always being the same. And if there is change, it was already there from the beginning. And this is the use of potentialities in Aristotle. There is a potentiality in the seed to make a plant, and it's already there from the beginning. But we should note that Aristotle didn't have much keener interest in reality as a whole. He took a certain part of reality and made it unreal. That's what I should say. he was focusing on the object, and he was focused on something that later came to be developed into what we call causality. Whereas Aristotle had still 4 causalities, they ended up being only 2 later on. I think it would be more proper to say there are as many causalities as there are concepts, and that's something that is explicit, something that's constructed after it happened. It's not the actual force, it's not the actual movement, it's a way of talking about the movement after the fact. I should mention also that Aristotle thought that all female animals had a lower amount of teeth. 1 pair was lacking in the female, because that was the case in horses, I think. And he generalized that, universalized that concept into all other animals, including human beings. But apparently he never cared to look in none of his 2 wives' mouses. He would have noticed they carry exactly the same number of teeth. And this is very, very typical, characteristic of Greek thinking. He wanted to universalize. So he was like an early Linnaeus or an early Darwin in that way. So he always wanted to go from the particular to the universal, and you see sharp tendency to go the opposite direction. The universals are in some way more significant than instances. And as I mentioned before, this is caused by the monetary thinking. Money can be exchanged for anything. It means that you can translate all objects, all valuables, all services as well, into money. Thereby you think you learned something. You can checking out how was the salary 10 years ago, or how the rent is going up, and so forth and so forth. It's a never-ending story. But both these ways, empiricism and idealism, which are early representations of Aristotle and Plato, they are both caused by a lack. They are also developing this lack, making it into a philosophy of some sort, thinking method. And they try to find a solution out of it as well, which is very typical. And should I wonder if they're so happy with their philosophy, why do they try to get out of it? This is very peculiar. And this tendency is very typical of the Western world. Everything connected to anything material is on one hand prioritized and being interesting, universalized, something you can observe, but it's also at the same time somehow lower than something else which is clearer. And this I have to cite one of my logical professors, Dag Westerståhl. He said that nothing can be truer than true in itself, like S equals S. This is the most true you can come. And I would say that is actually as the least true you can come, because you never touch the world at all. And there are another grave critique of it, is how on earth can you say that S equals S? There is a time delay when going from S to the equality sign to the other S. It never makes them equal. They're not situated in the same spot of time. And I think that's something we usually ignore, that there is actually a time lapse when we read the text, and this time lapse is significant. It's not to be ignored. So they have like an absurd view of simultaneity. They think that S equals S happens at the same time, whereas there is actually time lapse. And also, if you have a subject and object, you observe something outside yourself and you have a time lapse again. And I think this is a sort of a paradox people haven't really thought about to a high degree. They should, however, give it a ponder, because it's very important. It shows that something's wrong. We have a cat that's turning up again and again, and this cat will not be lied to. It tells you that there is a paradox going on. Something is not completely right. We need to think about it again and in a fresh way. And this lack is at the same time something to do with the body. We're not satisfied. Lack of satisfaction I talked about before, but it worsens as we approach the 20th century. In the late 19th century, people are desperate for meaning. And we have this wave after wave of depression. People do not feel motivated, and there is a general lack of energy in all of society. We are becoming laissez. We think everything is the same, and we become crueler and crueler. And this cruelty is completely ignored in history. It's a new effect. It has not been going on before. And the more we ignore this development, the stronger it becomes. It will by itself not let itself be ignored. And by not pointing it out, it will get stronger and stronger and stronger. And there is some truth to the saying, what we don't know can hurt us quite a lot. And I would say with a subject-object division, just because it's not exactly pinpointed, explicated and clear, it makes it so much more dominant. It becomes part of the background, and it makes us forget ourselves. And any form of ideology who doesn't take this into account is doomed to fail. It's doomed to make everything worse. And we saw that the event of politics, making things even worse. Because you can't change anything if you don't change the person's inside. That is doomed to failure. What we have in quantum physics is a way back to the observable, to something that is real. Reality is not an enemy of the human being. It's actually quite definitely a friend of human beings. So we need to rekindle our sense of reality, become once more part of reality, being embodied in reality and made more real. Well, I think I put a point there to the whole thing, and I thank you very much. It's become dark, and let's continue this in the next sequel. Thank you very much.